Cool. So one thing people always tell you never to start a talk with is an apology, but I will apologise. I've been ill this week. That was a bit rubbish. I've been ill this week. Thank you for your pity and sympathy. Jesus wants compassion, but I'll take pity and sympathy. And so my voice does sound a bit coarse and everything like that and gravelly. But if you find the husk a bit sexy, then in the words of the poet Beyonce, if you like it, put a ring on it. There we go. But bear with me this morning. I've done one service already. Thank you. Thank you. I'm here a week. So I want to tell you a story all about a painter whose name is Niggle. And like his name suggests, he's quite a perfectionist in what he does. So he works in quite a fiddling and quite an ineffective way. He spends a lot of unnecessary time on petty details. And as a result, all of the work that he produces, all of the artwork, he's unhappy with. He's really dissatisfied. There's a long journey that he needs to make, a journey that we find out is to the afterlife. But before his driver comes to collect him, there is just one painting that he wants to complete, one painting he wants to finish. And he's trying to paint this image of a leaf, and like all artists, once he gets an idea, lots of other ideas get going. And so he actually gets this idea that as well as the leaf, he can paint the whole tree. And behind the tree, he kind of envisions this big, vast landscape of mountains and a forest and snowy tips on the mountain. It just becomes a very, very, very big idea. And his idea becomes so big and he needs a canvas so large that he needs to stick it in the garage, get a ladder to get all the way up to the top of it. So it's a pretty big idea. I need a ladder just to get to the top of the screen there. Yeah. He starts his work on this painting and on this project. And he puts in a touch here, he rubs out a patch there, but he never actually gets much done. He's always niggling with it. And that's primarily because he's the sort of painter who can paint leaves better than trees. He used to spend a long time just on a single leaf. So he'd focus on the shading, he'd focus on the colouring to get everything just right, but he doesn't actually manage to achieve a great deal. And as well as that, he's got a kind heart, and so he does a lot for others when they're in need, particularly for his neighbour, whose name is Parish. And one night, Parish asks him to go out into the wet and the cold to fetch a doctor for his sick wife. And so off he goes, and as a result, Niggle comes down with a chill and a fever, and when he gets back, his driver has come to collect him to take him on his journey. And he weeps because he hasn't finished the painting, but he knows that he has to go. And shortly after he leaves, the town folk came to clear his house, and they noticed that on this crumbling canvas in the garage, only one beautiful leaf is left. And they stick it in the museum, they preserve it there, and for a long while, Leaf by Niggle hung in the recess and was noticed by just a few eyes. On the train to the mountains that make up the heavens, Niggle hears two voices. The first voice tells him about how much time that he's wasted, and it lists off this transcript with all the little that he's actually managed to accomplish in his life. And another praises him for all the sacrifices that he has made along the way. And when he gets to the outskirts of the heavenly country, he spots something. He gets off the train, he walks up so he can see it better, and before him stood the tree. His tree finished. Its leaves opening, its branches growing and bending in the wind that Niggle had so often felt or guessed, and yet so often failed to catch. He enjoys the tree in all its beauty, and then he comes across a shepherd who we know as Jesus, who moves him on and further up the mountain. Now, I tell you that story from Tolkien because it's our story. It's a story about work. It's a story about the big ideas that we all set off to work with. It's a story about how our work can sometimes seem quite fruitless and pointless and difficult and frustrating. It's a story how about whatever we do, whether it's in word or deed, that actually if we do it in the name of the Lord Jesus, with thanks given to God the Father through him, then actually the work we do matters. and it will matter. It all gives glory to the Creator. So we're in a series all about climate change, and we're looking at really practical ways that we can see God change the atmosphere and the climate in some of the key areas of our lives. And like we've said this week, we're talking all about work. And work, as Tim Keller puts it, is rearranging the raw material of God's creation in such a way that it helps the world in general and people in particular thrive and flourish. And so you get a farmer who takes seed and water and wind and sun, and they rearrange it into a crop that's harvested and is therefore beneficial for food for people so they can eat and sustain themselves. You get a healthcare worker who takes a patient, clothes, medicine, good bedside manner, not sitting on the beds. My mother's here as a nurse. She will tell you not to sit on the bed. And they rearrange that into something healthy. You get a builder who takes brick and mortar and what looks like lots of tea breaks and rearranges them into a house for others to live in. A parent takes a baby, food, drink, shelter, education, exercise, and rearranges it into a child, a teenager, a young adult who has hopefully learnt respect and empathy. And like me, a teacher takes pupils. They take a curriculum, attention, focus, communication, feedback, and they rearrange it into outcomes for students to progress and to move on. We might only paint a leaf or two with whatever we do, but our reward will be great. We will all see the tree. Not only that, but every brushstroke that we paint actually shows something of the kingdom. So whether it's the effort we put into a canvas, whether it's the attention to detail that we have in the numbers that we stick into a spreadsheet, or whether it's just running errands for those in our community or our parish, we show something of the sacrificial love of Jesus in everything that we do. And it's an ongoing story that's been told since page 1 of Scripture. The creation story, as we know, is a pattern of the way that things are meant to be. And the world was formless and void, or you can read it another way, it became formless and void. And so God plants a garden in the midst of it, this outpost that actually is a way in the midst of all the evil to bring back his goodness. And we are there in the garden, planted with God, and we partner with him in moving the world forward by getting to the edge of the garden, just like Adam and Eve, digging up all the weeds, tilling the ground, nurturing it until we bring some sense of order to the chaos, bring some sense of life where it looks like there's death, and bring some grace where it seems like there is none. And Tim Keller earlier in his book says, if we are to be God's image bearers with regard to creation, then we will carry on his pattern of work. His world is not hostile so that it needs to be beaten down like an enemy. Rather, its potential is underdeveloped. So it needs to be cultivated like a garden. So we are not to relate to the world as park rangers whose job is not to change their space, but to preserve things as they are. Nor are we to pave over the garden of the created world to make a parking lot. No, we are to be gardeners who take an active stance towards their charge. They do not leave the land as it is. They rearrange it in order to make it most fruitful, to draw the potentialities for growth and development out of the soil. They dig up the ground and rearrange it with a goal in mind, to rearrange the raw material of the garden so that it produces food, flowers, and beauty. And that is the pattern for all work. It's creative and assertive. It's rearranging the raw material of God's creation in such a way that it helps the world in general and people in particular thrive and flourish. So if we're put into the garden to work it, to take care of it, the question then becomes, well, how do we glorify God in it? Obviously through what we do, and then also by how we do it. So I've got 4 things, 4 ideas, 4 attitudes, 4 approaches that we can take into our work that I think will just transform the way that we do it and transform the spheres that we're in. And because I've learnt from some good Baptists like Neil and Seven, they all begin with the same letter of S. So there we go. The first one of those attitudes is satisfaction. Satisfaction with work. I think it's really important that actually when we go to work, we enjoy what we do. And growing up, I always felt like my dad hated work. He'd always kind of come back grumpy from a shift, a long, hard day. And speaking to him about it earlier in the week, it turns out that he did actually enjoy parts of it, mainly because of the colleagues that he worked with and, like, looking back, leaders that have been really influential. But as a child, the stories you hear, the table conversations that you just kind of pick up on, I got into my head this narrative that he really didn't enjoy it. And so what that means for me now as an adult is that actually whenever I'm unsatisfied with things, or I don't think things are going the right way, they're going a little bit peak-tong, then I get this urge to kind of up sticks and leave. And I have to resist that because that's not always healthy. Because work is a toil, right? Work after the fall, part of the curse, is difficult. It's going to be challenging occasionally. And just because things are hard doesn't mean that we opt out of them. And in fact, some of us are called to hard places so that we can churn up the hard soil there. I've definitely worked in some schools that have had some hard soil. And there's seasons to all of these things, including work. But saying all that, if you are in a place where you've tried to make things better, nothing seems to be sticking, nothing seems to be working, or you've got a leader who doesn't want to see you grow or flourish, then it might be time to move on and plant yourself somewhere else. Frederick Buechner says this. He says, "The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet." And obviously it doesn't take much for you to look around and see that the world's got a lot of needs right now. And so obviously things aren't always going to be fun, fast and easy all the time. But my belief is that if you have this deep-rooted joy, this deep-rooted satisfaction in what you do, then actually you should be able to weather the storm and stick with it. The writer of Ecclesiastes says there's nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live. Each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. And so I think in a really practical sense, it means about not getting bogged down in the atmosphere, in the weeds and the thorns that will inevitably come up as we go to work and put in a hard shift. But I think one really helpful thing that I've tried to do recently is to try and change the narrative. The staff room at a school can be a difficult place because it's a place full of gossip. It's a place full of negativity sometimes because your little darlings are not always little darlings. But it's really easy to get sucked into the negativity of that culture and that climate. And actually what I've tried to do over the last few weeks is to, because we've heard that the things we think about, the things that we actually say have an impact and do change the atmosphere, the climate, the culture we're in, is to just think about who I'm listening to, think about what I'm saying. And you can do the same too, because we can frame things in a positive way in the spheres that we're in. And we can actually have an impact there and change the soil in that way and show that actually we do enjoy it, we are satisfied with it. And things are tricky sometimes, but actually that doesn't change the deep-rooted joy that we get, because that's the gift of God. The next attitude that I think we can come to work with is with one of high standards. I think as followers of Jesus, we should be people that seek excellence in everything that we do and therefore perform well, not necessarily against kind of KPIs in a company or a list of targets on an improvement plan, but against achievable goals where we feel like that we've attained some sort of sense of success and others see something good and excellent in what we've made. And Paul in Ephesians 2 says, "We are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." And in the NLT, that word handiwork is changed to masterpiece. That actually, if we've got a creator God who has sculpted us and crafted us out of the clay of the earth, then there should be something in the work that we do that reflects something of the masterpiece of our creator. And Dorothy Sayers says it like this. She says, "The church's approach to an intelligent carpenter is usually confined to exhorting him not to be drunk and disorderly in his leisure hours and to come to church on Sundays. What the church should be telling him is this, that the very first demand that his religion makes upon him is that he should make good tables. No crooked table legs or ill-fitting drawers ever, I dare swear, came out of the carpenter's shop at Nazareth. Nor if they did could anyone believe that they were made by the same hand that made heaven and earth." And a lot of scholars say now that Jesus maybe wasn't a carpenter, or maybe carpentry was just a small part of what he did, because it turns out there's not a lot of good wood that you can use to make stuff out of in Israel. It's more likely that he was just a general kind of craftsman, handyman, probably did a lot of stonemasonry. But the saying still applies, right? That what Jesus made with his hands captured something of the Creator, and therefore it should be the same with us too. With whatever we put our hand to, it should show something of God's masterpiece. Next up is the idea that we should be staked to the ground. I think we should be grounded in our values, grounded in Jesus' stories, grounded in ideas about the kingdom, grounded in love and grace and care for God and for other people. Because if we're grounded, we can go to work with confidence that whatever comes our way, good, bad, ugly, that we'll be able to ride it out, because we have a measure of integrity, because the values that we espouse and the observable behaviours that we've operationalised, the things that we say and do, match up. They go together. And so when there's tough decisions, we're actually able to balance paradoxes with wisdom and tenacity. When there's difficult things that are being discussed at work, we can actually point a way forward beyond whatever has been suggested in any boardroom. We can make progress where there is no way. We can challenge practices that we think are unfair or unjustifiable. And our slogan for this series is all about being a thermostat and not a thermometer. And a thermostat obviously sets the temperature. It doesn't just read it. It senses the ambient temperature of the place, and then it turns the boiler on and off to keep it at the level that we've set it at. And so if things drop, then the thermostat brings them back up. We influence the spheres that we find ourselves in. And last week, Neil was talking about Ephesians 4, and he had those steps. And Paul in Ephesians 4 is talking all about the Gentiles. And he's saying that you shouldn't be like the Gentiles. That's not the way of life that you've learned. You should live like Christ. But the Gentiles, they harden their hearts. And a step down from that, actually the things they say are questionable. And then that turns into some behaviours that are a little bit tricky. And it's quite easy to go down those steps that we saw last week. It's very, very easy to go down those steps. But we should be thermostats and not thermometers, right? We should notice when our hearts are hardening a little bit. We should notice that actually, I've just said that, and out of the heart, the mouth speaks, right? Something's wrong. I need to check that. I need to reevaluate that before I do something that is a bit questionable, a bit tricky. And so if we're open to that, if we're able to recognise that, if we get into those good habits and that good practice, then we'll be able to soften our hearts to whatever God wants to do. And I think that will ultimately have an impact on others. So all that's well and good, talking about all these things to do with work, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense to talk about work and not talk about rest. And so a rhythm I think we need to have, an idea that I think is really important, is one of Sabbath. And there's a group of us at Kingston. Obviously, we used the Practicing the Way resources right at the start of the year. But for the past year, even before we did it together as a church in January, there's a group of us that get together and we work through the practices and work through some of the resources. And this time last year, we were working through Sabbath and thinking through how in a culture of hurry and exhaustion, this practice can actually be really useful, setting aside a day so that we can rest and recover and recuperate. And there's lots of people in our group. Amanda's one of the people in our group. Donna and Nigel come along as well. Donna says everything, literally everything, is life-changing. And but genuinely, I don't use this word life lightly. This is a life-changing practice. And Jesus in Matthew 11, he makes this invitation to his disciples. He says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." And in the Message, Eugene Peterson puts it this way. He says, "Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly." And Nathan and I have this running joke at the minute. Whenever we catch up with each other, normally whenever we're kind of getting ready for the evening service, I'll just ask him how he is, how his week's been. Just be a nice person. And the running joke at the minute is he will always say that he's tired. And the irony of today is that he only got 2.5 hours sleep last night. But he's got a lot to do, bless him. He's trying to be a great husband to Beck. He's got to try and be a good parent to the boys. He's bringing law and order and justice to the streets of Essex as a policeman. And then he's got the joys of co-leading the evening service with me. He's got a lot on his plate. And as well as that, he's just about to move house and he's about to get a new post after getting a promotion. And so he could probably do with a Sabbath and a little bit of rest and could probably do with the boys not waking him up on his rest days. But in our work, both of us have gotten to a point of burnout. And actually, it was a couple of years ago where he pointed out in me, because he'd already gone through it, that actually there were some of the signs that I was showing that were quite unhealthy, where I clearly got quite depleted and quite low and just needed to step back from some of the commitments I had, step back from some of my responsibilities, change the way I did my role, put in these new rhythms so that I could recover. And obviously, we both love what we do. We'd sacrifice a lot for what we do, but sometimes that comes at the expense of taking care of ourselves. And so we just make sure now that we keep ourselves accountable. So I have this rhythm of Sabbath. I try and check that he's having a rest when he's off as well. And the reason why we do Sabbath is because God commanded it, right? So in Exodus and Deuteronomy, there's these two commands to the people of Israel. And in Exodus, they are told to remember the Sabbath because they've just made their way out of Egypt through the Red Sea and they need a new way to live. And so the basis of remembering their Sabbath is all based on the pattern from the creation story. God tells them that he worked for 6 days and then he rested. He sets it apart and he makes it holy. And if God needs to rest, I'd suggest so do we. Some of you need to definitely hear that this morning. And then Deuteronomy is written to the children and the grandchildren of the people that leave Egypt. So they've been walking through the wilderness for 40 years. They're born out in the desert and they've become disillusioned. They've become quite frustrated because that journey should definitely not have taken 40 years. And they think that it would have been better for them to go back to Egypt. But they obviously don't know what it was like. And the second book, the title of Deuteronomy actually translates to second law. So this is God giving them the 10 Commandments a second time. And he says to observe the Sabbath. The verb there is used differently. So it's remember the Sabbath in Exodus, it's observe the Sabbath in Deuteronomy, because they've clearly gotten out of that habit. And the reasoning he gives them changes as well. So he talks about the creation story in Exodus, and then he says, remember that you were once slaves in Egypt. Remember that you were subject to the tyranny of your masters. Remember all that stuff that you had to do. Remember you didn't get a rest day. Remember you had to make all those pyramids and move that stone yourself. And God reminds them that he brought them out of there so they don't need to get stuck in their old ways of thinking. And our culture can sometimes feel a little bit like Egypt or Babylon or these, insert any name of kingdom of the Bible here, right? That just keeps you on the hamster hamster wheel, keeps you going, keeps you on that treadmill, says that you always need to do more, says that you can't get off the treadmill. But you can. God says, remember the Sabbath, observe the Sabbath. And there's 4 movements to it. Based on the kind of definition of the word in Hebrew, there's 4 kind of helpful rhythms. The first is to stop, then to rest, then to delight and worship. And in terms of picking a day, you can do it on any day that works for you. A lot of Christians tend to do it on a Sunday because that's obviously when we gather together as a church and worship in community. But you can do it in the middle of the week if you've got an unusual work schedule and you work shifts and you have an unusual pattern. Or you could stick with the Jewish tradition, which is what I do, just because I tend to kind of do this kind of thing on a Sunday or run the evening service. And so I consider that work. So I rest on my Saturday. And the Jews tend to do it from sundown on the Friday to the same time on the Saturday. So I try and stick to that if I can. But that's just all based on the creation of, there was evening and there was morning. There was the first day. So you start the day with your sleep. You start with rest. And then the day ends with everything else. So you can choose when to do it. And in terms of what you actually do on that day, we obviously don't do work because you've stopped that, but you can kind of fill it with whatever you like. But if you read the wider literature, there's lots and lots of helpful things. These are kind of best practices. So there's 12 things there that you might want to pick from. There's lighting the candles. You normally do 2 candles, one to remember the Sabbath, one to observe the Sabbath. You normally bless the children, eat a Sabbath meal, express gratitude, sing, worship, walk, nap, make love to your spouse, read. We found it very funny in our group this time last year, and we said it was very important that you make love to your spouse. There you go. You can read, especially read some scripture. Spend time alone with God, spend time with family, friends, in conversation and celebration. It's not a to-do list, right? You don't have to do all 12 in one day because that just feels a lot like hard work. But this is just a list of best practices of what the ancients over the years and over millennia have said and done. But however you do it, you might want to pick a beginning and an ending ritual. So when I'm doing this well, because, I get out of rhythm like we all do. But when I do it well, I normally start off by lighting the 2 candles to remember the Sabbath and to observe the Sabbath. I normally read a book, normally by a Christian writer, and then as part of our group, I'll sometimes share a quote from it to kind of keep myself accountable, because then I'm making sure that I do that. But you can fill your Sabbath with whatever you like, as long as it's not work, okay? And if you're not sure kind of what to fill it with, then these questions might give you a bit of a guide. They're all kind of based around stop, rest, delight and worship, and you can kind of filter everything through that. So you take the activity and you ask whether it will help you to stop. Is this ceasing what you do on a normal work day? Second is rest. So is this restful? Does it refill your soul? Does it give you energy? Does it renew your strength? Like that passage from Isaiah says. Delight, does that activity bring you joy in God? Do you find yourself happy, grateful, connected to God as you do it? And then worship. Does it help you to connect more deeply with God, his goodness, his beauty? Do you find yourself led into praise? And if you ask those questions and you fill your day with all of that, I can guarantee, pleasure stacking all the things that you love to do, that actually if you have that day each week, you'll find that you have a new attitude anyway. You'll find that you're actually satisfied, enjoying what you do, having an impact on how you do it. You'll have high standards, and that excellence will show something of God's masterpiece in the things that you make. You'll find that you'll stake to the ground so that whatever comes your way, you bring something of God's goodness to the world. And whatever you do, however many leaves you end up managing to paint, you'll see the tree. You'll learn how much the sacrifice was worth it. Why don't we stand, and I'm going to pray the band again.